We're going to be talking about the Christ myth theory today because a lot of the atheists I was dealing with at the time were all about the Christ myth theory.
A lot of them do propose the Christ myth, which would say Christ never actually existed because pagan religions and so on have very similar traits in their deities. So, that somehow shows he never existed.
Well, just in the first thing you said there, John, you said that some atheists will say so-called other deities of these other faiths have similar traits, therefore Jesus never existed. Yeah. Sometimes they do make an argument that looks like that. Of course, I hope most people can see that even if it's granted or given,
it's a non sequitur.
That Jesus shares traits with other divine figures in other religions or something like that, therefore he didn't exist. Of course, that's there's no connection between those two things, but usually that first premise, if we want to call it that there's these similar characteristics, usually that's not shown to be accurate in the first place. And so what I mean by that is you'll have these guys say, well, Jesus's death looked a lot like name some other person.
Horus, that's the common.
Yeah, that's a common one. Here's one I like to talk about. Is Attis. You don't hear as much, but sometimes you do hear Attis. And it's like you look at it, and it's funny because with Attis specifically, there's two death accounts for Attis. One killed by a boar, the other one he castrated or emasculated himself and then bled to death. And there's these weird details about how this went down, and then they'll say, well, the cult of Attis also had a resurrection. And it seems like, from what we can gather, there's a scholar named A.T. Fear who specifically writes on Attis and related cults, and he actually postulates that the idea of resurrection as it's taught, it's not identical to Christian resurrection, and certainly is even, quote, a latecomer to the cult. And so this is a common thing we also deal whenever there's these supposed parallels. A lot of times you see the cult that is being spoken of actually has modified itself in significant ways as it's responding to the challenges of Christianity. That's helpful to know and realize. And you said they mentioned Osiris, and it's like one of the problems is where do we get the information about these supposed figures? A lot of times the information that's being summarized by the atheists will be after Christianity. So, for example, some of the information we have about Osiris comes from Plutarch, writing in the 2nd century. This is after Jesus has already lived and died and resurrected and everything else, and yet they'll take that information, summarize it, but the actual source is post-Christian. And so it becomes difficult to know, are they writing about something that we could really certainly trace back earlier to the religion? Because a lot of these Hellenistic religions, these greco-roman religions, were very moldable, very plastic, very elastic. They definitely would change with the times, even at the level of doctrine. And really, the concept of resurrection as it is in Christianity is completely unique. For example, there's a French scholar, André Bollinger, who says, quote, "The conception that the God dies and is resurrected in order to lead his faithful to eternal life is represented in no Hellenistic mystery religion," end quote. And so the people I'm quoting are actually scholars who deal directly with studying these ancient cults, because a lot of times when you deal with an atheist on these, very rarely do they say, let me open up to a primary source about Osiris and read from it and then exegete it to explain what it means and show how it's a parallel to Jesus. And let me give you the dates on this to show you how it's before Jesus. And let me give you some evidence that Christians borrowed these concepts and incorporated into their fledgling religion. Yep. You don't get any of that. You'll get...
I know.
Yeah, it'd be nice if we did, though. But the thing is, the reason you can't is because usually all that information would go against their case.
Yeah. And then they're accused of the appeal to authority fallacy, which technically isn't a textbook fallacy, if you actually quote scholars and how they actually think about the whole Christ myth theory.
Yeah, well, it's a few things. It's looking at what scholars on these issues say, but it's also seeing their interaction with the primary sources. Yeah. And if you ask the atheists, where'd you get this information? Well, certainly they're not reading it in the original language, and that's okay. Most of us aren't. Okay, yeah. So they're getting it from some source. Well, where did they get it? Because usually what they're repeating back to you is a summarized version. They'll say, well, this God, this happened to them, this happened to them, this happened to them, this happened to them, just like Jesus. But they don't actually quote you verbatim. Rarely do you get that, or rarely do they give you the source from which they're drawing this summary from. Because what happens is, if you go to the primary source, read their summary, and compare it to what the primary source says, you'll notice that what often the atheist has done, maybe it's inadvertently, maybe they're repeating something someone else has done, is they've sort of baptized the religious language in Christian terms. They'll describe a death on a hook. Like there's a God, I forget which one it is, the top of my head, supposedly died a death on a hook. They'll describe that as a crucifixion because the God is suspended and hanging in air. And they'll say died via crucifixion. That's not a crucifixion.
Yeah, like they're saying Horus and Osiris died by crucifixion, even though that didn't exist back then.
Yeah, you'll get stuff like that. And I mentioned Attis. Specifically, most of our info from him comes from Firmicus Maternus 350 AD. And a lot of our other information on Attis actually comes from Christian writers themselves. And this resurrection usually has to do with like the cycle of the spring, the return of vegetation. And it's not really death and resurrection. It's just simply a cycle that the God is supposedly going through. But it's not like this is happening in time and space, like say in Galilee or on Calvary or in Jerusalem. It's where is this happening? And it's very rarely rooted in any kind of real thing. And so a common thing to do if you're interacting with these kinds of atheists is just to say, that's an interesting thesis. Could you show me where some of these primary sources are so I can read about these gods for them myself? Because check this out. If someone says, what's your source? You're telling me Jesus rose from the dead. You're saying his death is described as such. And I'm not saying they actually believe it, but I'm saying if we want to say we believe Jesus died this way, the sources say this, we could point to the New Testament. Not only that, we can point to Joseph, et cetera, et cetera. So they can see what the first accounts of Jesus say. We need to be able to see the accounts of the gods they're describing as well, to read it with our own eyes to see if what they're saying is accurate. And time again, it's not accurate in how they describe the activity of these other greco-roman gods. That's probably a good place for me to kind of say my big critiques of the Christ myth theory. I got 5 that I kind of summarize as their big problems. I'll explain what I mean briefly by them.